technical problem. So, at Director AIMS and our senior colleagues from AIMS, and also all the state center of excellence and regional center of excellences. Dear colleague, this video conference is of particular importance to all of us, primarily also from Ministry of Health point of view. And I would like to thank all of you for being participant today. To just set the context right, we would like to highlight that in the last almost a month, sudden rise in large number of cases as well as deaths have been reported across the country. Second challenge which we are experiencing is that something which was more of an urban phenomena to begin with. Now we are finding larger number of cases getting reported across all parts of the country, primarily even from tier 2, tier 3, and even sometimes even in rural areas also. This being the situation, we had taken help of our National Center of Excellence, AIMS New Delhi, and we had requested all states to come up with a state level center of excellence, which in turn were discussing with respect to the clinical management protocol and then taking it down further to all the COVID dedicated facility. This time, considering that the trajectory is high, considering that it is spread across the country, we are now requesting 14 of our tertiary care institutions across the country to be the regional center of excellence, which have also joined today. I would like to thank all of them for being part of our endeavor in this direction. And these institutes, along with center of excellence, we just would like to sort of refocus on the challenges with respect to home isolation, challenges with respect to early identification, and also again something which happens within the hospital setting, that is the clinical management protocol. We have recently issued guidelines related with home isolation. We have also issued guidelines how the pediatric cases have to be managed and multitude of other issues. We are also facing the challenge that everyone thinks that remdesivir is actually the panacea for all evils. And all of us, I'm sure, must be getting those requests, kindly provide 2 injections or remdesivir, etc. Similarly, we realize that everyone wants to get a CT scan done. So with this type of panic which is around the system, we would like to take your support in terms of first coming on common page on the clinical management protocol through this network of national center as well as the regional center of excellence and state center of excellence, and then involve through you all the districts. So we just do not want to remain dedicated to the dedicated COVID hospitals alone. We want this exercise to be taken to all the health professionals across the country, which would mean up to primary health center level. Every doctor should be aware, because if they are not aware and they are not able to support in terms of early identification, the case which will come to a tertiary sector will always be a complicated case. So how do we sort of demystify the whole clinical management and whole of this COVID management approach is what is our endeavor presently. Through you, once these series of trainings are over, we would request regional center of excellences and state center of excellences to make a district level plan of action where we are saying COVID dedicated facility. We are requesting all health professionals up to PSC level, all private sector doctors, all private sector hospitals across the country to be oriented on clinical management protocol. We have an advantage of technology today, something which otherwise would have required, to sort of come together on a platform by calling for a physical meeting. Now we can actually electronically talk to each other. We would like to leverage that. We have requested Eco Platform people, which is again a training platform utilizing Zoom, to support us in this endeavor. Every 2 people have been appointed for each state. So once you will partake in this training exercise which is going on presently, then we would request you that in collaboration with states, you would make a district level training plan of action where the same Eco Platform can be put to use, so that the platform part, what to use, what not to use, that problem we need not sort of worry. Second thing is, within this platform, there will be 2 approaches. So that we can manage our conversation well, there will be few people who will be allowed as panelists, that is, they can have 2-way interaction. And there will be larger set of audience which can be brought together as webinar, and they can do chat and then interact. So Director AIMS will also explain how this will work today also. But our idea is just to reflect on when we wanted to train around 5,000 people across the country as the vaccination centers and vaccination center in charges. We did this exercise, and through the same platform, in the single stroke, 5,000 people were oriented. So the number of people which we can get on this platform is total of 10,000 in single shot. So that is the advantage we would like to sort of leverage on. So we would request, when you kindly take these trainings down below, and even these trainings which are going on right now, allow larger set of audience to come on a webinar mode, so that everyone can hear even directly from AIIMS and then see the discussion which entails as part of the training program. So I am also joined by Dr. Ravindran from Ministry of Health, looking after disaster management. Also our Director Public Health, Mr. Govind Jaiswal. They will also be coordinating with you on a regular basis and taking up this process forward. Idea is that 5 workshops in a week, 2 weeks we cover it. Parallelly, we take this exercise and prepare a district level action plan through you and implement it. So I'll stop here, and I would like to thank all of you once again for being part of this endeavor, for supporting and guiding us. We would like to submit, we feel it is a great challenge we are all collectively passing through, and we need your support to manage this challenge. It is not an easy job, but I'm sure with your support and guidance, we'll be able to manage it. So with these, I would request Director AIIMS to kindly take over, please. Thank you, please.
Thank you very much. And at the onset, let me really thank all of the mentoring institutes, the regional centers of excellence that have come on board. I'm really grateful to all the faculty that have joined and have become part of this endeavor and as part of this team. Many of these institutes, I would say almost all of them, are part of the team that we had when we started our exercise of building up more and more labs as far as states were concerned and even medical colleges were concerned. So many of you are, many of these institutes are sort of aware of the activities that were done then. And we would like to use that and leverage that now as far as clinical management is concerned. As has already been said, what we're seeing is that this pandemic is now moving and it's also going into rural India, into the hinterland. We're seeing cases occurring there. But a lot of physicians who are having to manage COVID 19 really have no training as far as this is concerned. We may feel that we are at a tertiary care center, we know what to do, we know when to give steroids, we know when to give remdesivir, we know when to give anticoagulants, we know what works, what doesn't work. But think of a physician sitting in a primary health center and he suddenly has a surge of COVID 19 patients. How will he triage? How will he decide what treatment to give? What strategy should we adopt in terms of home isolation, in terms of other therapies, including oxygen therapy? So this is endeavor is basically to build a team of mentoring institutes, regional centers of excellence, and then these institutes will then further take this down in terms of having online platform programs right up to the district levels, so that we can confidently say that every doctor, no matter what be his specialty, or he be a general MBBS doctor, has a basic training of the do's and don'ts as far as treating COVID 19 is concerned. So this is the aim of this entire exercise. We'll start off with having some topic discussions, presentations. These slides we could share with you and you could use them if you want to really disseminate it in your region and your area. Whatever interactions you need from our side, we will support that. And I would really request that you then see how you can use your regional center of excellence to take this forward into other areas and be able to become a hub for knowledge exchange and knowledge transfer in your area, so that almost every doctor who's practicing in that area, both in the government and the private sector, is roped in to understand this management of COVID 19 from mild, moderate to severe, and to understand that what drugs work, what don't work, and the timing of drugs. We have to bring down our mortality, we have to save lives, we have to develop a strategy that despite the increasing surge of cases, we are able to manage patients properly. It is something that we need to do on a war footing, considering the number of cases that we're seeing right now. Therefore, I'm grateful to all of you for having come online and taking up this responsibility. The Ministry of Health and Family Welfare will help you in coordinating this at regional level to make sure that this is disseminated right across the country, even to the remotest areas. So today we'll start off with a talk on mild COVID home isolation. We will build this up with various topics. If you have suggestions of topics that you think are important, or you feel that you would like to participate and give a talk on a topic, we can consider that. But please remember that ultimately, at the end of the day, you will have to be part of the whole knowledge dissemination process. AIMS will be the mentoring institute, but each area will be the regional center for excellence. And each center will subsequently take on the responsibility of that region. We as AIMS will also take on the responsibility of Delhi and Bihar. Other areas will have to really look at their own areas. And this was done when we did the lab testing. That, for example, AIMS Jodhpur looked after Rajasthan and Gujarat. So those type of distribution can be done, and all that area should be covered by the Center of Excellence in terms of knowledge dissemination, in terms of making doctors aware, using this platform, and that will really help. So today we have to begin with a talk by Dr. Saurabh Mittal, who's a faculty in the Department of Pulmonary Critical Care and Sleep Medicine, on mild COVID home isolation. He will he will give that small talk. Then we can have an interactive session with your suggestions in general and more related to this talk. And then we can see how we can start disseminating this not only in your own area, but right in the whole region, so that there is enough awareness about managing patients with COVID-19. I'll stop here and ask Dr. Saurabh Mittal to really give his comments. If you have anything in between, use the chat box, or we will you could raise your hands and we will then ask you to ask the question or the doubts that you have. Before I ask Saurabh to sort of continue, I'll also like to introduce the other panelists that I have from the institute. On my left is Dr. Anant Mohan, who's the professor and head, Department of Pulmonary Critical Care and Sleep Medicine. And I have Dr. Manish Suneja, who's also a faculty and professor in the Department of Medicine and Infectious Diseases. So both of them will also be there to help you and try and develop a strategy. So over to Dr. Saurabh Mittal.
Thank you, sir. So now we will be discussing a little bit about the mild COVID-19 and how to manage patients during the home isolation. So we'll be discussing about what are the eligible patients, how do we provide them home care. In patients who are under home isolation, what are the indications for hospitalization for them, and when do we stop home isolation. So we all understand that COVID is an illness which has been caused by a virus, which is the SARS-CoV-2 virus. And it causes a respiratory illness which varies in severity from asymptomatic or mild illness to a severe life-threatening illness. So the spectrum of illness varies greatly from asymptomatic to severe, and that's where we need to kind of triage these patients, that which patient gets treatment in which facility. So before we go for home isolation, the basic concept of spread of COVID-19 is essential to understand, because that's what makes the concept of how do you isolate a patient who is infectious. So there are basically three ways COVID-19 spreads. The most
slides are not moving, sir. Slides are not moving, sir.
I think
stop share करके maybe load again.
Escape karo, escape, stop share, share again.
So kindly do the slideshow and then start moving the slides. That will be.
We'll do that. I think that looks like Dr. Dhruv Chaudhary. We'll do it. Just give us a few minutes. We have a little bit of a glitch. We'll sort it out. On to the side, you need to bring that.
That's only for us. Yeah. Amarjit, उसका display ठीक करो.
विजय नोएल का मैसेज आ गया, इस सौरभ को बोलो शेयर स्क्रीन करे. फिर लॉन्ग में बैठा हुआ. Should be on.
Are the slides visible now?
Yes, sir.
So the
Yes,
slides
yes.
are visible, but it's on a presentation mode. So can you click on the display settings and switch to duplicate? Only then we'll be able to see the whole screen.
But that's what we are doing. On our screen, it's on a duplicate mode. We'll just try and see how else we can change it.
So if you see the display settings on the top, that should help.
So kindly help them.
Is that better now?
So you need to reshare your screen. It stopped actually.
अब तो अब हो जाएगा इसको. Come out. And also request everyone whose video is on to really switch off the video. That may also help.
So
Now
no, video has,
Is it
you
now
just need to-
visible? Are the slides visible now?
it is now.
Perfectly, sir, perfectly.
Okay, good.
Stop video no, on our side.
So if we understand that there are three ways COVID-19 basically spreads. The most important way is the droplet infection. That means whenever a patient speaks or coughs, there are droplets containing the virus and they kind of stay there in air for some time, and then in next 15 to 20 minutes, they settle down. So that is the primary way of spread of COVID-19. The other one is the fomite based, means the surfaces which comes in contact with these droplets, and once a person touches them and then touches his nose or mouth, then he can have a fomite based transmission, which is probably the least significant way of transmission. The third route of transmission for COVID-19 is the airborne transmission, where the tiny virus particles may stay in the air for longer duration. This is very important in patients who are hospitalized or in the areas where there are intubations or nebulizations are performed and a lot of aerosols are generated. So these are the three ways COVID-19 spreads. Whenever we decide for home isolation for a patient, we need to see that we prevent the spread of disease to others by blocking all these routes. So why are we discussing about home isolation? We have had so many diseases till date, and we have not really discussed that home isolation for most of those diseases. The problem is that the numbers are huge and we need to preserve the limited hospital beds for moderately and severely ill patients. And secondly, patients who are infectious, we need to contain them into an area so that they prevent the spread of infection in the community. So those are the two important reasons home isolation is necessary for management of COVID-19. So now we'll have 2-3 important cases, and we'll see that which of these actually fits in the home isolation and how do we go about it. So now we have a patient who is 35-year-old male doctor who does not have any comorbidities and who is symptomatic for 3 days. Room air saturation is 97%, and he lives in a 2-bedroom bathroom house with the wife and 1 child. The another patient is a 58-year-old female who is a housewife, known case of diabetes and hypertension, has 5 days history of fever, cough. Room air saturation is 95%, and she lives in a 3-bedroom bathroom house with husband and her 2 children. The third patient is a 40-year-old male who is an office employee, who is a post-renal transplant on immunosuppressive therapy. He has 4 days history of fever, cough, and shortness of breath, and he has a room air saturation of 93%. He has a 1-bedroom house with wife and 1 child. So these are 3 patients. First has a saturation of 97% without any comorbidities. Second has a lady who is diabetic hypertensive, has a saturation of 95%. And the third is a patient who is on immunosuppression and has a saturation of 93%. So we will see that what are the criteria to identify the home isolation patients. And in the end, we'll find out which of these is the candidate for a home isolation. So before we decide for a home isolation, it is essential to classify the patient in the disease category of severity. So there are 3 disease category severity: mild, moderate, and severe disease. depending upon the symptoms, the occurrence of dyspnea or shortness of breath, respiratory rate, and room air pulse oxygen saturation. So these three parameters, symptoms, room air saturation, and respiratory rate, are used to define a patient regarding the severity of disease. So patients who have upper respiratory tract symptoms with or without fever, but do not have any shortness of breath or hypoxia, that means room air saturation more than 94% and respiratory rate less than 24, are the candidates who are classified as mild disease. And this is the only category of patients who are recommended for home isolation care. So what are the prerequisites for home isolation? So the most important thing is that patient should be a mild or an asymptomatic case, which has to be decided by a doctor. Secondly, there should be a facility at their home for self-isolation. Self-isolation means patient should have a separate room for himself or herself along with attached toilet. Patients who are immunocompromised, such as patients who have HIV, transplant recipients, or cancer therapy, they are not candidates for home isolation. And they should only be allowed after a proper evaluation if it is thought that they are unlikely to worsen and their disease is actually mild and other comorbidities are well controlled. Similarly, elderly individuals, individuals who have comorbidities in the form of hypertension, diabetes, heart disease, chronic lung disease, chronic kidney disease, or chronic liver disease, who have history of cerebrovascular disease, they should only be allowed after proper evaluation, meaning thereby they are not the ideal candidates, but if their comorbidities are considered to be well controlled, they may be kept under home isolation. Another important thing for home isolation is that patient should not remain alone in the house. There should be a caregiver available to provide care to the patient on a 24/7 basis. And this caregiver should have a communication with the treating hospital or a treating doctor or a treating physician on a regular basis during the entire duration of home isolation, so that patient management does not suffer and we do not end up in a complicated situation. So now once you decide that any of the patient who is fit for home isolation, what are the instructions you need to give these patients? So these instructions can be in the form of regarding physical distancing, mask use, hand washing, their symptom monitoring, what do they do, how do they manage their symptoms, and how do they stay in connect with the healthcare provider. So regarding physical distancing, patient must stay in a single identified room with attached bathroom. The room should have well ventilation and should have windows. If they are windows, they should remain open, and room should have a good cross ventilation. The patient should stay away from other people in the home, especially elderly and those with the comorbid conditions. If patient has to meet any of the family member on an emergency basis, he should wear a N95 mask if he is meeting any of the family member. A patient should not share personal items with other family members. He should continue to use a triple layer medical mask throughout the duration of home isolation, and the mask should be discarded every 8 hours. But if a mask is visibly soiled or wet, it should be discarded immediately. And ideally, the mask should be discarded after disinfection. Disinfection is usually by the 1% sodium hypochlorite solution, which is, so we all understand that how to wear a mask, but it is essential once you diagnose a patient with COVID-19, you should teach for home isolation. You should teach them that how should they wear a mask at home to prevent the disease in their household. The mask should cover the mouth, nose, and chin of the individual. And then it should never be touched from the front, and only the loops of the mask should be used to remove the mask. And it should be changed regularly at 8 hours interval or when visibly soiled. And after each mask use, you should wash your hands. Now, patient should be advised to wash his hands with soap and water for at least 40 seconds, or they should be cleaned with alcohol-based sanitizer. In the room where patient is staying, The surfaces should be cleaned, which are touched often, such as tabletops, 1% hypochlorite solution. The hand washing technique should also be explained to the patient so that there is no chances of spread of the infection in the household. So monitoring of the symptoms is one of the most important aspect of home isolation. That means we need to teach the patient what all he is supposed to look at and what are the danger sign and when he should report to the hospital. So patient should monitor his symptoms uh, along with vitals, which includes temperature, heart rate, and pulse oxygen saturation. The use of pulse oximeter is strongly encouraged for monitoring during home isolation because it provides you about the pulse oxygen saturation as well as the heart rate. So patient should monitor all these parameters and should also give subjective feeling of whether he is improving or he is same or he is getting worse and whether he is developing any shortness of breath from what it was before. So this monitoring chart actually gives us a very good idea whether the patient is improving or worsening. And if there is any deterioration of symptoms, patient should report to the hospital. There are some instructions which should be given to the family members who are caring for individuals with COVID-19. So first, one more important instruction is that they should continue to wear a triple layer mask within the house. And if at all they have to enter the patient's room, they should wear a N95 mask. For the family members, hand hygiene is essential, which should be done before wearing and after removing the mask. After they come in contact with patient or the immediate surroundings, it should be done using the soap and water for at least 40 seconds. Or if it is not visibly soiled, they can use an alcohol-based hand rub as well. They should avoid a direct contact with patient secretions, especially the sputum or the respiratory secretions, because they are one of the most infectious secretions. And if they have to handle patients, any of the secretions or urine, etc., they should use disposable gloves. They should avoid exposure to potentially contaminated items in the patient's environment, such as cigarettes, eating utensils, dishes, drinks, used towels, or bed linen. So these patient's food should be provided to his room itself. The utensils which are used for the patient should be cleaned and they can be reused by the family members or the patient himself. That's not a problem if they are cleaned with soap and detergent thoroughly. After you change your gloves, you need to clean your hands always and always wear the triple layer mask if you are cleaning any of the surface, clothing or linen used by the patient. So this is essential to prevent the spread to the family members of the patient. Now comes to how do we manage the patient. That means what are the medications or what are the things patient should do to improve his symptoms. So one thing is patient must communicate with the treating physician and should promptly report if there is any decline in his symptoms or any worsening or saturation falls. So patient should need to continue the medications which they have been taking for like for hypertension or for any other comorbidities which were well controlled. They need to continue those medications. Patient should take adequate amount of fluid and rest because during high grade fever there is a lot of insensible loss, and if patient do not maintain adequate hydration they are at risk of worsening. So 1 to 1.5 liters of fluid is minimum, but depending upon the fever patient need to increase their fluid intake. For fever they need to take antipyretics as and when required, which can be in the form of tablet paracetamol or 500 or 650 milligram on 3 to 4 times per day. For throat symptoms, sore throat, patient can use warm sterile gargles twice daily. Steam inhalation is not routinely needed, but for patients who are having upper respiratory symptoms, they can do steam inhalation once or twice daily for a few minutes. For patients with mild illness, ivermectin can be taken, which is in the doses of 200 microgram per kg per day for 3 to 5 days, which usually comes out to 12 milligram tablet once daily for 3 to 5 days. For excessive cough, antitussive cough syrups can be used. Use of vitamin C and zinc is also optional, but it can be used for patients with mild illness in under home isolation. So if patients continues to have bothersome cough after 5 to 7 days of illness, they may consider use of budesonide MDI, which is 400 microgram, 2 puffs twice daily with the spacer. So it has been shown that it may reduce the severity of cough in patients who continue to have severe cough after 7 days of illness. There are some other drugs which are being used by people in home, but which should not be as of now. So the decision to administer remdesivir or any other investigational therapy should always be taken by a medical professional and in hospital setting only. Patients should not attempt to procure or administer remdesivir at home. For patients with mild disease, early disease, systemic oral steroids are not indicated. For patients who who continue to have symptoms beyond 7 days, such as persistent fever or cough, there are new recommendations coming for the low dose oral steroids, which we will be discussing in the next session. Now, what is important is what are the things which patient has to understand that when he should seek help of a hospital. If patient develops difficulty in breathing during home isolation, if there is a fall in oxygen saturation to less than 94% on room air, if patient has persistent pain or pressure in the chest, or if there is any mental confusion, inability to arouse, or any difficulty in sensorium. So these are the important symptoms when patient should contact a hospital or a healthcare provider and ask for further help. Patients who are at high risk disease, such as having hypertension, diabetes, chronic diseases, coronary artery disease, immunocompromised, obese, or elderly, in these patients, the threshold should be low to contact a healthcare provider so that they do not present to the hospital in a later stage. So it is very important that all this monitoring is done during home isolation so that an appropriate timing for hospital care can be decided. Now comes the question, when do you stop home isolation? So patients who are under home isolation, they can end their isolation after 10 days of symptom onset and no fever for 3 days. If they remain afebrile for 3 days and 10 days have passed since their symptom onset, they can end isolation and there is no need for testing after the home isolation period is over and they can resume their functioning depending upon their functional status. So now we come back to our initial slide that which of these patients are the candidates for home isolation. So if we see the first patient who is a young male with maintains oxygen saturation and has a good facility is the best candidate for home isolation. The second patient who has many comorbidities and still has a maintained oxygen saturation and a good home facility for isolation is a candidate for home isolation, but that should be under very close supervision in view of the multiple comorbidities. So it is a borderline candidate, means a patient has home isolation and a good facility to report to a healthcare facility, they can continue in home isolation. The third patient who is a post-transplant patient on immunosuppression with an oxygen saturation of 93% is actually not a candidate for home isolation. So that's how you need to, these are the things you need to keep in mind while you advise them for home isolation versus a hospital-based care. So here I'll conclude my talk that what is essential is that you need to correctly categorize the patient into mild, moderate, or severe category. You need to give instructions to the patient as well as the caregiver, and that should be made very clear. The danger signs which the patient or the caregiver should identify should be explained to them and provided to them in written. And a continued communication with healthcare provider is key to successful outcome following home isolation for COVID-19. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Saurabh. Yeah, thank you. My name is Dr. Rajiv Kumar. I am not a pulmonologist. I'm an associate dean for academics at AIIMS, and I'm coordinating these activities on behalf of AIIMS New Delhi. Dr. Guleria unfortunately had to step out because of an urgent call just now. The objective of these COEs, as Dr. Guleria had initially clarified was that we discuss these among ourselves first, but then these need to go out at a very basic level, at a PHC and a CHC level, where the physician or the treating doctor may have read these guidelines but would not have understood how they need to be communicated or applied to their patients. And therefore, the objective of this discussion or this presentation was easy for the last mile healthcare delivery person to understand. For the next 5 to 10 minutes or 15 minutes, we would like to have a discussion among the people on the panel from the regional centers of excellence or the state centers of excellence, if they would like to have any discussion on what was presented. So maybe you could just unmute yourself and raise your points.
वहीं से बोलना शुरू करो। They can raise their hand and we can speak for them.
All right. So if the questions that are there in the chat box. So one of the questions that
Yeah. Can
Yeah.
I just ask a question?
yes, please go ahead. Please go ahead.
Yeah, so
Please
this is,
identify yourself, because there are so many images and they're so small that sometimes it becomes difficult to identify who's speaking. So if you could
Yeah,
just identify
that's
yourself,
right.
please.
So this is Dr. Satyajit Mishra. I'm here of anesthesia at AIIMS Bhubaneswar.
Right. So please carry on.
Yeah. So regarding the symptomatic management, it was mentioned that consider ivermectin and vitamin C, zinc, and budesonide and all that. While the indications for budesonide are a little more clear in the sense that if the patient has cough, he or she can take budesonide. What about ivermectin? And so it's like kind of, is it a blanket prescription for all mildly symptomatic cases, or is there any indication for a case-to-case management? Because it's really not clear why when we should consider ivermectin. It's just written that consider, but it doesn't specify whether it should be considered in all patients or not.
Right. Excellent. So this question came up on virtually every little discussion that we've had on the management of mild COVID. Dr. Ravindran yesterday and the day before from the ministry alluded to this a little bit in his talk a day before yesterday, but I'm going to ask Dr. Manish Taneja to give us a little bit of update on this.
So this matter has been discussed a lot regarding ivermectin. Initially, what we had in the previous version in the national document was HCQS in high risk factor groups. But subsequently, whatever the evidence has come, they are obviously a very, very low certainty evidence. But there has been some evidence of benefit. Probably we are reading too much into it. But what the protocol says, national protocol for management says to consider. So probably patients who are symptomatic and are having high risk factors are the ones who should be offered this therapy. May not be in asymptomatic patients, really there's nothing much to do, but at least in patients who are symptomatic with fever and are having high risk factors, maybe the suitable candidates for this sort of therapy.
Thank you, Manish. Anant also wants to add something here.
So just a small add-on to this. See, most of these guidelines are in a kind of way, living guidelines, that they are likely to be revised. Whatever we get as of now, the best evidence, then one goes for that. The studies are still ongoing. Evidences may keep changing like they have been for the last 1 year. So it is quite possible that things may be a little variable after a few weeks to months. So that may happen. But as of now, this was the rationale and the best possible thinking behind this drug. One thing which I would like to say is that probably we may see the dose changing. If at all ivermectin is found to be more useful, we might see a dose changing and a recommendation towards a higher dose. Why? Because pharmacokinetic wise, this dose may not have a good lung penetrability. That is one. So there are people looking at that. So these things may change, but whatever we know, even if there is a semblance of benefit, probably then one can go for it in that particular level of high risk patients, as already has been mentioned.
Thank you, Anant. We'll move on to the next question if we have any, and this is for a discussion within the panelists to begin with.
Can you hear me? Good afternoon, everyone. I am Dr. Nishant Chauhan from AIIMS Jodhpur. Am I audible,
Right.
sir?
After that, we'll take the question from AFMC. I saw them raise their hands. So we'll take this one and then from AFMC.
Yeah, I'm Dr. Nishant. So regarding the use indication for inhaled budesonide, what I came across through in a research paper in phase 2 trial, that study mentions the use of budesonide within 7 days of symptom onset, irrespective of fever or cough. And the earlier you start, the better what they found. And whereas in the guidelines mentioned by ministry, they have specified that if the cough persists beyond 5 days, then start, and specifically for cough. So that is not mentioned in that paper. So is there a different paper, or could you please elaborate the difference in the indications?
Any one of you? Manish?
Okay. So there are two studies on which basically the use of budesonide has been considered. So if you look at one of the studies, they did a subgroup analysis. The benefit was more pronounced in people beyond 7 days of onset and was less. So it was effective even in first 7 days of illness, but the benefits were more pronounced when it was given beyond 7 days of illness. Now, when this matter was discussed, the issue of giving a steroid too early in the course of disease, whether that would be leading to more viral replication in the first few days, maybe so a considered decision, I think, has been taken that as such majority of patients, 70-75% of patients will have their symptoms settle down by day 5 of their illness. And some patients maybe who are progressing, maybe going towards the prolonged phase, maybe going towards the cytokine storm. So that small subgroup of patients have been identified for this type of budesonide therapy.
Thank you, Manish. We'll take the question next from AFMC, please.
Good afternoon. I'm Dr. Atal. I'm the rheumatologist from AFMC Pune. I was going through the circulated, and on the first page, I think para 3, column 6, patients eligible for home isolation. We've asked for caregivers and contacts to take hydroxychloroquine. So are we still continuing with hydroxychloroquine for caregivers and contacts, or is it out now?
It's still there.
It's still there.
Is Dr. Ravindran available at the ministry? I see the ministry's cameras turned off. So it's because he was on the panel that made these guidelines as well.
Yes, thank you. When we consider these guidelines along with aids at that point of time, we looked at the evidence, as rightly pointed out. The evidence is on a lower side, but again, we had been using it. We used it to a great extent. Many countries used it. Unfortunately, we couldn't make it in the form of a study to save in a very evidence-based way hydroxychloroquine is useful. But when we looked at the studies, which is also, some insight is given by Australian researchers in a live meta-analysis, which is called HCQ meta. In fact, they are also looking at other, chemical moieties like ivermectin. And, some of these studies, 24 of them they're double-blind, placebo-based control studies, but there are evidence to the fact that one, early treatment, quite substantial evidence in terms of, your case control and odds ratio and those kind of studies, and also for prophylaxis, even for ivermectin. So it's based on, and as rightly pointed out, it's an ongoing process, dynamic process. We will go. So we thought, since this is already in the guidance, we thought that we'll give some more time till we look at the evidence and whether to keep it as a part of the guidance or to remove it. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Sir, if I may, sir, so then now that we are supposed to disseminate this information down to the smaller centers or smaller hospitals, So do we ask them then as and when the caregivers and other people ask, we then go ahead and we continue with hydroxychloroquine for them in across, right? That is the present guideline until something else comes through.
Our basic objective is to follow the guidelines that the ministry puts out for us. We also have to accept that for a lot of things, there may not be evidence of the kind that we require. There certainly isn't level 1 evidence for a lot of things that are being said. All of us accept that. Nobody is trying to hide that fact, and we just work on the best available information that currently exists. And we are required to follow the guidelines that the ministry has set out. That has to be our bottom line in what we put forth to everybody else. We would rather follow the guidelines rather than deviate from what the guidelines are. And we accept the fact that the evidence may not be as robust as we would want it to be, but we follow the guidelines as they are as of now. I see a number of questions in the chat box which relate to a number of topics that are not being covered today. A lot of them talk about the use of Fabiflu, or the use of remdesivir, the use of tocilizumab, ventilation. We understand that these are most important questions. However, we have 8 or 9 more of these webinars that will happen over the next 8 or 9 working days. And we anticipate all of them would be covered progressively over those few days. So we will skip those questions for today. Please understand that we're not trying to ignore you, but we just have finite period of time to cover that stuff today. I see Nigrims having raised their hand, so maybe they would like to ask the questions next. And then Jodhpur after that.
This is Dr. Vijay Nampir from Nigrims. I just want to know what is the panelists' consensus on awake proning while we're keeping the patients in home isolation, and whether that's indicated or not.
Yeah, Vijay, I think yes. So awake proning definitely has benefits, as we all know. So in the borderline case of patients who are borderline hypoxic, it sometimes really increases the saturation by even 2 to 3 or maybe even 4% that we have seen actually real time by talking to several patients. I think it's a very simple kind of a procedure which can be easily done by everybody, and it really reduces the panic level. You know, suddenly if you see at home, a person is monitoring his saturation every couple of minutes almost, and if one of them goes down to 93 or 92, suddenly there's a panic as to what to do, and then they start calling everybody around. At this stage or even before this, if we tell the patients that look, if you go around 94 or so, start proning, try to explain to them how it is to be done, because they may not know what is the proning, for how long it should be done. There is a definite technique and a duration to that. But if we emphasize that you start it early enough, definitely the need for oxygen requirement might go down, and definitely the mental stress and the panic will definitely go down.
Thank you, Anant. We have a question from Jodhpur.
Yeah, it's a first small comment that last year we had conducted such webinars, and we had trained a lot of doctors from periphery, not only online but offline as well. And what to be done for home care, what can be done at PHCs, CHCs, district hospitals. So it was really sort of sensitization to them, what to be done, how to manage critical ill patient, and not to refer all the patients to AIIMS Jodhpur. Second, one more thing which I wanted to highlight was most of the clinical practitioners, they have this habit of writing too many drugs, even if the patient is at home care. For example, almost everyone I have seen, they always prescribe azithromycin or doxycycline, and then favipiravir, we know that, but all these things, so we hardly have any evidence of all these things working. So my suggestion would be not only the presentation should include of what to be done, but also should include there's hardly any evidence and may be harmful because of side effects, maybe QT prolongation and gastric irritation or all those things. So if we don't have enough indications or enough evidence for using all those drugs, why not just include all those things so that peripheral doctors are sensitized? Okay, then if it has no role, we should prescribe them. Just a comment.
That's an excellent comment, sir. And your experience in having done this last year obviously comes in handy in adding that. So when the states and the regional centers of excellence make their presentations, this presentation will be shared, it will be available. You could add that information, and we will certainly also add that information of what should not be done instead of just saying what should be done. So an excellent point that you make, sir, and we'll add that to our presentation. And we would also have the states doing that as well.
And we
There's
had
been a couple of
prepared a small booklet which was sent to the district authorities as well as to state government. But unfortunately, I don't think any action was taken, but we had sent a recommendation in the booklet form.
So maybe you could send that now to the central ministry as well. And if it still is in line with what the current guidelines are, they may be keen on having that disseminated as well. There are a number of comments.
This is Dr. Anupam Dey from AIIMS Bhubaneswar. I'm head department of medicine here.
Yes, please carry on.
Yes, sir. Thank you. I'll refer to this guidance document on home isolation. It mentions use of 1% sodium hypochlorite to disinfect the masks and also surfaces. Now, many of the people may not be able to procure 1% sodium hypochlorite. So can it be made easier to use an alcohol-based sanitizer or a spray for disinfecting the surfaces for ease of use? Can we recommend that?
Dr. Ravindran, sir, maybe you could give us an update on that.
Thank you. I think it's a question which has come time and again to us on this. You know, when we talk of sanitizing the mask, it's not that when we use sodium hypochlorite and then reuse it. That's not the purpose. The purpose for putting that was when you are using it, and if you before you throwing out, use 1% sodium hypochlorite, which can be made in dilution. And your point is well taken. That dilution is per se not available across the drugstores. It's a higher concentration which is always available in the drugstores. But having said that, now there are modalities which has come up. Central Pollution Control Board has come up with recommendation that you need not even put that there. You just keep it in a dry some kind of cover for 72 hours, and then you throw it as a normal waste, household waste. That is one of the recommendations of the Central Pollution Control Board. So we are looking at that, and maybe we'll incorporate in the coming versions of this. Your point is well taken. But alcohol, I may not suggest, because its availability in cities and all is very good. But as you move down, number one, it's costly. Number two, to disinfect using alcohol sprays and all. This is the recommendation given by NCDC. I am not the person, so I am speaking on behalf of NCDC.
Right. Thank you, sir. Are there again? I'm going to yes, Nagpur.
Hello, sir. I'm Dr. Kumbhalkar from Nagpur, AIIMS.
Right. There are two people from Nagpur who raised their hands. Maybe both of them could go on one after the other.
Okay. Sir, I want to know in home isolation which markers should be sent, and what is the period of admission. If nowadays the trend is seen that most of the patients, they are running very high grade fever, and they come to the hospital after 5 to 7 days of their fever. So what plan will we give to these cases now? They are already, they have taken Tamiflu, they have already taken ivermectin and other drugs, and there is no response to fever. So what are the guidelines to admit and regarding the treatment plan of such cases?
So there are two questions here. First is, how do you determine end of care at home? What do you decide is the end point of care at home? Therefore, what are the admission criteria? And second was, when do you get markers done if the patient is in home isolation?
The first thing that we need to be very clear about, as such patients, mild patients in home isolation, there is no requirement of any routine markers to be done, which is being done very commonly. Even CT scans are being done in mild patients at home isolation. So such investigations need not be done. Now, Dr. Saurabh clearly pointed out the symptoms and symptomatology when a person is supposed to get hospitalized or supposed to get in touch with his treating physician. So like desaturation and other things, chest tightness, etc. And finally, one more.
Yes, those were the two things. When do you get admitted and about markers? So you say markers should not be done if the patient is in home isolation and fits into the home isolation criteria. And the second was indications for admissions are as defined in the guidelines.
And additionally, I think ma'am was also referring to a very important point of a prolonged fever, a fever going beyond 5 days, maybe going beyond 7 days, and not patient is not really desaturating. Now that is a gray area. That is a group of patients which are some proportion of it may land up in hospital later on with moderate COVID, with desaturation, etc. So that is a very important area, how to prevent and treat this patient at home and prevent them from coming to hospital, and thus the freeing up hospital beds. So this is an important area, which I think there is a separate discussion on this in the next meeting. As of now, the guidelines do talk about low dose steroid, but only in consultation with the treating physician, and there will be many riders to it. I think that is a topic for separate day, but this is an important group of patients.
Steroids can be given.
And obviously, yes, these new guidelines also mention about two things. Among patients who are symptomatic beyond 5 days with high-grade fever, that is, one is use of a potent NSAID like naproxen to suppress the immune response a bit, and secondly, use of inhaled budesonide to prevent going into moderate disease. So these are the two options that are there for this set of patients.
Thank you, Manish. Again, I would like to just refer to a lot of questions in the chat. A lot of these questions are obviously extremely important and crucial questions, but there is no way that we can address all of them on one meeting on this platform. That is why this meeting or meetings like these are to be replicated within each regional center and within each state center. So everybody would have multiple opportunities at smaller group levels to address these questions. Some of these relate to specific case vignettes, some of them refer to specific individual patients, and some of them are very state specific as to where do I send my patient if he is collapsing and I don't have a hospital. So unfortunately, at this national level platform, we would not be able to address all of these. And at this level, we are primarily addressing issues that the regional centers of excellence and the state centers of excellence need to discuss about it on a common platform. So if there are any other questions coming on from the live attendees, yes, Nagpur, there's an, I can see a hand raised again. Yes, sir.
Good afternoon. I'm Dr. Arvind Kushwaha from AIIMS Nagpur. I have a few questions. Firstly, sir, the criteria for keeping people in home isolation are definitely clinical, and in that major component is the SpO2 level. Now, the question is, sir, if all members are positive in a household, I think there is no role for these so-called strict provisions that we are putting on home isolation, that these kind of decisions. If all members, because it is mostly a very efficient domestic transmission that happens. Whether they test negative or positive, later on, most of them are going to test positive, that we have seen. It's a family cluster. So if all members are positive or are showing signs and symptoms, firstly, is there any role for very, very strict, stringent measures that we have said, that he put in a different room or something? That is one. Second question is, regarding low threshold for high risk for complication cases, where the SpO2 level less than 94%. What does exactly the low threshold means? Should it be that we set the threshold at 98 or 97, or should we bring the threshold down to 90 or 92? That is second question, was not clearly understood. Third question is, the criteria for putting people under home isolation have not taken into account the number of cases that are taking place in remote rural areas where people can't even get tested. And secondly, availability of hospitals, oxygen, ICU, that should also be taken into account when we are trying to develop criteria for home isolation, because the criteria will vary from place to place depending on all these factors. So I think we had to have a little more stratified approach rather than a uniform approach everywhere. Because a person living in a rural area of Maharashtra or a UP may not actually even have a pulse oximeter. We are assuming that everybody is going to have a pulse oximeter, which is not likely. So can we have some answers to that?
Okay, so you make some very pertinent questions, of course, and all of your questions are very pertinent. I'm going to ask Manish to address whatever we can, but before I ask Manish to address them, again, like I said, I'm not a pulmonologist. I'm a urologist by profession, and I'm not a part of the guidelines. But what I can tell you from general knowledge about these is the guidelines typically have to be simple so that they can be acceptable to a large number of people in general. But of course, there will have to be modifications to make them applicable to individual circumstances or regional circumstances within the overall guideline of what the overall framework of what a guideline says. So the more we stratify, the more conditions we put into it, the more difficult it becomes to apply them to a wider range of public applicability. But you're absolutely right that everything may not be applicable the way it's written to everybody, and therefore there would have to be physician-based modifications based on the applicability. But that's just a general comment that obviously doesn't apply to my knowledge of this particular guideline. Manish, do you want to add to a couple of things? Some of the very pertinent questions was if everybody is positive in the house, do you really need to apply all these guidelines?
Then they really don't apply. It was primarily meant for one person is positive and others are asymptomatic. This guidelines apply to these households. If everyone is positive, obviously what we are seeing in this current wave, probably they won't really apply.
Anand, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, so that is true. The only thing is that one should be still reasonably alert enough to pick up these warning signs. So because the problem progression may happen in any one of them, so they may not be that strictly following the physical barriers and all those things, but they must be still equally vigilant to pick up the warning signs in any of them. So that the severe disease is picked up early. That's the only thing.
Thank you. So the other question that he had was about saying that you have a lower threshold for people who have comorbidity. So is there a way of defining that, or?
Low threshold basically doesn't refer to threshold of the saturation, probably refers to the threshold of overall symptomatology in the background of comorbidities. Well, I feel this gives the leeway to the treating clinician. It cannot be very objective, but it does give a leeway to the physician. Now, a patient may have a list of long comorbidities, so we have to keep a low threshold there as a criteria for admission. So I think it cannot be objective, but it does give us a leeway to assess the patient's overall and then decide on admission criteria.
Yeah, so just for example, I'll give you an example of somebody, for example, having an ILD, interstitial lung disease, or a chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, and who gets this kind of a infection. In that situation, already the lungs are compromised. You know that he may be in a borderline oxygenation state. So at that point of time, we may have a more stringent criteria for hospitalization of these patients who fall into the relatively high risk category. So just an example. So basically, this is the flexibility given to the treating physician, keeping the overall clinical situation in mind, that how well the person is likely to tolerate that level of the oxygenation, or how likely is he going to, how badly will he suddenly crash. So he should not crash. That's where this the flexibility of kind of flexibility is there for the physician.
Thank you, Anand. Are there any other questions from the panelists on the discussion point? Yes, sir, from Nimans.
Good afternoon, sir. I am Dr. Hemchandra here. I am Vice Chancellor, Medical University, Dehradun, sir. We are following all the guidelines given by the ICMR and the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare. What we have done basically, while selection of the patient for the home isolation, we also hand over a kit of the containing many things, that is ivermectin, azithromycin, B complex, vitamin C, paracetamol, and the cholecalciferol, pulse oximeter, mask 50, triple layer, and the thermometer. That is basically a packet is given to, so that once the patient is under the home isolation, need not to come out to search out any thing required for the home isolation. As you know that in the second wave of the COVID-19, that the virulence is very high, infectivity is very high due to the genome sequencing. We have observed that some of the home isolated patients, they are getting worse and worse immediately, that within the 4 or 5 days, and despite of having, they are well observed from the remote by the control room. So, and they are being brought to the hospital. They are being brought to the hospital where the oxygen facility and then the DCH facility are available. So meanwhile, we have observed while going through the death audit of the hospitals, especially the Doon Medical College and the Srinagar and the Haldwani. These are the 3 medical colleges, and the fourth is the major is the AIIMS also. That the majority of the patients, they are approaching to the hospital, they are having less than the 70% SpO2. So what we have a audit committee here, and we have a advisory committee also, based on the experience of our doctor basically. At the committee level, we are taking care of, but the committee, we have decided that while a patient is in such a status, and at the same time, as you know, at most of the places, the beds are not available for the admission. So it is recommended that from our side, we are recommending that a dexamethasone 6 mg BD or the methylprednisolone 60 mg BD, that can be tried on the way while the patient is being shifted. And it is better to be shifted to the nearest place where the oxygen other facility, that is DCHC, and further to the DCS hospital. This is a strategy which we are going to adopt. So I would like to have your advice on this aspect, sir.
All right, sir. Do you want to take a question on drugs today, or should we leave that for tomorrow? It's actually a part of what we are discussing tomorrow. Not tomorrow, but the next discussion on the next webinar is actually on home isolation and use of medication, including steroids. So if you permit, we would take this up at that time.
Okay, sir.
There was a question being raised from
So the guidelines are very clear with respect to who is an eligible candidate for home isolation and when the home isolation ends. Could we have some little more clarity on what is the criteria to escalate from home isolation to hospitalization? If there's a standard criteria, that is question number 1. And question number 2, sir, as Dr. Arvind from AIIMS Nagpur, sir, has clearly mentioned, is it possible for the guidelines to be tweaked for areas where there's far to reach areas who do not have access to measure saturation? Can we have a syndromic approach based guidelines to implement home isolation?
All right, so I'll take both of your questions. I think the first one would be relatively easier to answer than the second one. The first one was about criteria to escalate from home isolation to hospitalization. They have addressed it, both Saurabh in his presentation and Manish briefly, but maybe Manish, you could just give 1 or 2 points again on when do you shift to the hospital.
No, I think the point is very valid. What is being referred to, I think there are 4 or 5 conditions are given when a patient is to be hospitalized, but maybe the point is to have it a little wider net to include more conditions which may require admission. So that point is well taken. The second point is about
changing the guidelines to make them more
syndromic approach.
Syndromic, yeah.
So probably
I'm not sure we are quite qualified to answer that question, honestly. I think that's something that the ministry would need to take up on the guideline creation panel.
So, I'm Dr. Ravindran this side from the ministry.
Yes, sir, of course. Please do. Please do.
Yeah, this point is very well taken of syndromic approach. You know, during the prior to the first wave also, we had looked at it, whether it could be possible. And now also, I think a committee under DGHS is examining this. And maybe, you know, the problem is validating such a tool, you know. In all our program areas where we have used, you know, syndromic approach through a validated tool, you know, there is evidence building as the initial part of it. Now for that, we don't have time. So they are trying hard. There is a group of experts who have, I think, met twice on this syndromic approach. And maybe we will see, and maybe AIIMS will also be got involved in that. I think AIIMS director was also in one of those meetings. And if something materializes, definitely we will share. It's a very good idea, which is already under consideration in Director General of Health Services. Thank you.
Right. Thank you for the clarification.
Thank you.
Yeah, Mother AIIMS Nagpur has their raised hands up. Yeah.
Yeah, I would just like to add here that we are talking about saturation not being available to everyone. But what we have already included in the guidelines is the fact that we are talking about the respiratory rate also. So, you know, a higher respiratory rate is something that can be taken care of by anyone at any place in the country. So, and in case there is a physician who is able to do a video call, if there is a physician at the PHC, you can just measure the respiratory rate and know that, it's very simple to figure out that someone is in respiratory distress. So even if there is no availability of a saturation, I think even people at home can figure out what a respiratory rate is and decide to go for a hospital admission.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point, that not just that, even presence of any increase in breathlessness or dyspnea or unexplained dyspnea, these are the two very simple clinical parameters that can be easily asked and seen even without a saturation. So at least then one can suspect that something wrong is happening, because otherwise, apart from these, as you know, that there is really no specific symptom as of now which can tell anybody that he is going into a critical phase. Of course, there may be symptoms like altered sensorium, chest pain. Those are, of course, life-threatening or serious ones as it is. But for COVID alone, probably if you want to go to the grassroots level, one will have to keep very, very simple markers where SpO2, respiratory rate, and increase in dyspnea or unexplained new onset dyspnea are, I think, good enough criteria.
Thank you, Anant. You see, I understand this discussion about availability of pulse oximeters is not going to be resolved that easily. It's a well-known fact. It cannot possibly be available everywhere. All of us accept that. But then, like you pointed out, and what's been pointed out here is it's one of the markers that has been given where it's easy to do, but that may not be the only marker. And you obviously will rely on your clinical judgment to whatever extent you can. So it's a known fact. It cannot be available everywhere. Every one of us accepts that, and therefore we have to use whatever is available as a surrogate at that point of time. Any other questions? We will need to move away from this availability of pulse oximeters discussion. If there's something else that we need to, yes, sir. AIIMS Nagpur, I can see your hand raised again.
So in continuation with the question asked by Dr. Amrusha, as far as the respiratory rate, role of respiratory rate being used as one of the criteria. Sir, we all know that the component of anxiety after a person tests positive is very high. And we know that respiratory rate can be a big confounder when we try to categorize a disease according to that in that setting. So it may not be the right thing to do at this point of time. That's my point.
Well, again, not as a pulmonary physician, I would suggest that you don't measure it immediately after you give him the report, and you give him some time to digest the fact that it's positive and measure it after a few hours or maybe the next day. I'm not being flippant about the answer. All I'm trying to say is that all of us understand the limitations that we are working with in a country that's 1.3 billion strong, with a huge variation in healthcare availability. To assume that one particular guideline will be uniformly applicable with all resources to everyone is simply not possible. And therefore, guidelines that are made with the assumption that they can be applicable to a large majority with local variations and local adaptability, which is where all of you people come in. That's where your experience and your knowledge comes in. That this doesn't work in my area, but I have found a surrogate to fulfill this criteria. And that's why dissemination has to be at a local level and not sitting at the All India Institute of Medical Sciences in New Delhi, which is why we need your help to take it down to a level where you can modify it, bring in your experience and your knowledge to say this is what works as a surrogate to fill this guideline. I'm sure, I'm speaking on behalf of people who probably are not answering right now, but that's my interpretation of it. There are again lots of questions in the chat. I'm also happy to see a lot of people are answering those questions on the chat also. So people have taken on the role of mentorship among themselves, and that is extremely good to answer some of those questions. We cannot have people who are on the chat to be speaking on this particular forum, but they would be panelists within their regional COEs. So they could raise verbal questions when they are panelists on their regional COEs. Are there any questions among the panelists right now that we need to discuss today? We will, of course, be back on Monday for the second session, which will again be on home isolation, on medications and steroids and other medications in home isolation. So if there are none, I will just reiterate what we are trying to do here. This is a beginning whereby we aim to have between 8 to 10 of these sessions over the next 8 to 10 working days. So Mondays to Fridays, we tentatively are planning it at 3 p.m. every day from Monday to Friday for the next 8 or 9 working days. There may be mild changes based on exigencies, but that's the plan. The regional COEs and the state COEs don't have to wait for all 10 to finish before they start working in their own areas. You could start working right today or tomorrow itself and decide that what we've discussed today, I have enough. I want to now do this within my region and within my state. So you don't have to wait for the 10 days to be over before you start. Please feel free to start at the earliest that you feel you're capable of starting. The slides will all be available. The video, I'm sure the ministry would make available to you if you would prefer to use the video that's been presented. You're welcome to make your own slides. You're welcome to do your own presentations, as long as you're confident with what is being done. If there are any further comments from the ministry, Dr. Ravindran or anybody from the ministry would like to say something before we close.
Thank you, Professor Rajiv. It's fine. I think it's a very good beginning we have, and I believe that this will go a long way in taking the message across to the grassroots level of how to manage the patients. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. And I think the most important takeaway today has been the fact that everybody realizes that they need to innovate at a local level to implement. I think that's one of the biggest things that we have learned, that everybody realizes the limitations that they work with, but they've also found a way to bypass that limitation. And that is the crux of the matter here, that you know your region, you know much better than anybody sitting here how things work in your region. And therefore, your involvement is crucial to making sure that this information goes to the lowest levels with the modifications that you need to do, adhering to the overall framework that the guidelines have. Thank you very much, everybody, for being here. We're hoping we will have all of you back again on Monday. There were more than 550 people logged in today, which is excellent at such a short notice. And we hope to see you again on Monday, sir. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you, sir.